Chapter 1: The Young Warrior Who Defied a King. The story of Mzilikazi, the founder of the Ndebele Kingdom, begins in the heart of southern Africa around 1790. Born into the Kumalo clan, he came of age during one of the most turbulent times in African history. His early years were shaped by the rise of Shaka Zulu, the legendary warrior who transformed the Zulu nation into a mighty empire. Mzilikazi served under Shaka, and from him he learned discipline, military organization, and the art of leadership. But unlike many of Shaka's commanders, Mzilikazi carried within him a vision that stretched beyond the borders of Zululand. From a young age, he showed courage and intelligence. Stories passed down describe him as tall, sharp-eyed, and commanding in presence. He was not only a fighter but a strategist. His Kumalo lineage gave him a sense of independence, and though he admired Shaka's genius, he refused to be a mere servant to another king. The tension between loyalty and ambition would set him on a path that reshaped the history of southern Africa. Mzilikazi's first test of leadership came when Shaka entrusted him with command over a regiment. He quickly gained the loyalty of his men through strict discipline, fairness, and an uncanny ability to read the battlefield. He fought with distinction in Shaka's campaigns, driving fear into the hearts of rival clans. Yet as victories piled up, so did suspicion. Shaka was a ruler who trusted few, and the growing reputation of his Kumalo commander stirred jealousy at court. The break came over cattle, the wealth and lifeblood of Zulu society. After a successful raid, Mzilikazi kept a portion of the captured herd instead of sending it all to Shaka. This act was more than disobedience. It was a declaration of independence. Shaka demanded punishment, but Mzilikazi refused to submit. With several hundred loyal warriors, he broke away from the Zulu kingdom, setting into motion one of the greatest migrations in African history. This was no small decision. To defy Shaka was to risk annihilation. The Zulu king was relentless against traitors, and his armies were known for their speed and brutality. Yet Mzilikazi trusted in his courage and in the loyalty of his men. They marched north, crossing rivers, plains, and forests, pursued at times by Zulu regiments. What began as a flight soon turned into a conquest, for everywhere they went, Mzilikazi's warriors clashed with local tribes, defeating some, absorbing others, and adding to their strength. It was during these long marches that Mzilikazi's leadership shone brightest. He turned his small following into a disciplined army modeled on Zulu regiments, but adapted to new conditions. Unlike Shaka, who ruled through fear, Mzilikazi often ruled through respect. His warriors followed him not only because he was fierce but because he shared their hardships. He marched when they marched, ate what they ate, and fought where they fought. This sense of unity bound them together in the face of countless dangers. The land they crossed was vast and unforgiving. Droughts tested their endurance. Enemy ambushes threatened their survival. Yet each trial forged them into something greater than a band of fugitives. They became the backbone of what would later be called the Ndebele nation. At night, around campfires, Mzilikazi would speak of a kingdom yet to come, a land where his people could be free from Shaka's shadow, and where their children could grow strong. These words gave his followers hope and purpose. By the late 1820s, Mzilikazi had established himself as more than a rebel. He was now a king in the making. Settling first in the highveld of what is now South Africa, he began building the foundations of a new state. Villages grew under his protection. Warriors trained under his command. Cattle herds multiplied, giving his people wealth and stability. Though the threat of Shaka never fully disappeared, Mzilikazi had carved out a place for his vision to grow. The story of Mzilikazi's early years is the story of defiance turned into destiny. He was not content to serve another man's empire. He believed in carving his own path, even if it meant crossing unknown lands and facing endless wars. His courage, combined with his skill as a commander, transformed him from a fugitive into a nation builder. And though the road ahead would be filled with bloodshed, betrayal, and endless battles, his dream of a kingdom was already taking shape. For many in southern Africa, Mzilikazi became a symbol of resilience and power. He showed that no king, not even the mighty Shaka, could hold down a leader with vision. This first chapter of his life was not just about rebellion. It was about the birth of a kingdom that would rise in the heart of Africa, under the banner of the Ndebele. Chapter 2: The Long March North. After breaking from Shaka Zulu, Mzilikazi led his loyal warriors into the unknown. What began as an escape soon turned into one of the most extraordinary migrations in African history. Known later as part of the Mfikane, this movement reshaped entire regions of southern Africa. The Kumalo chief who had once served under Shaka was now a king in all but name, with followers who trusted his vision more than life itself. Yet the road north was filled with hardship, bloodshed, and constant danger. The group that followed Mzilikazi was small at first, perhaps only a few hundred men and their families. But as they traveled across the grasslands and river valleys, they absorbed other groups, sometimes through alliances, other times through conquest. His army became a mosaic of different clans, yet under his leadership they began to move as one. This ability to unify different peoples into a single disciplined force was one of Mzilikazi's greatest strengths. He used the Zulu regimental system but softened it with a more flexible style of leadership, one that encouraged loyalty through respect as much as fear. Life on the march was brutal. Droughts dried rivers, forcing them to dig for water. Raids from hostile tribes tested their courage daily. At night, warriors stood guard while families huddled around fires, listening for the rustle of enemies in the dark. But with every battle won, their confidence grew. They were no longer fugitives from Shaka. They were becoming a nation forged in struggle. Around the campfires, Mzilikazi reminded them of their destiny, a new land where they could be free, where their children would live without fear of Zululand's reach. The first major challenge came in the Highveld, the wide grasslands of what is now South Africa. This region was home to powerful Sotho-Tswana states, and they did not welcome Mzilikazi's growing force. Clashes erupted as his warriors raided cattle and defended their herds from counterattacks. The battles were fierce, with assegais clashing against shields and dust storms rising as men fought hand to hand. Mzilikazi proved his genius in these conflicts. He used surprise attacks, ambushes, and fast-moving regiments to crush much larger enemies. In one famous encounter, he led a dawn raid that completely shattered a rival settlement, adding hundreds of warriors to his ranks. But victory came at a cost. The more powerful Mzilikazi became, the more enemies he attracted. The Boers, Dutch-speaking settlers pushing northward from the Cape Colony, soon crossed his path. They were armed with muskets and wagons, and their style of warfare was unlike anything the Ndebele had faced before. Mzilikazi fought them fiercely, using speed and cunning to offset their firepower. His warriors would rush in before the Boers could reload, striking with deadly precision. Yet the wars with the Boers weakened his position in the Highveld, forcing him to look further north for a secure homeland. The march resumed. Families packed their belongings, cattle were herded forward, and warriors kept their spears ready at all times. They crossed the Limpopo River, entering what is today Zimbabwe. The journey was long and exhausting, but Mzilikazi kept his people moving with iron determination. He was no longer just a commander. He was a father to his people, guiding them through hunger, disease, and endless battles. His presence inspired hope when despair threatened to overwhelm them. At last they reached the southwestern plateau of Zimbabwe, a land of rolling hills, rivers, and fertile soil. Here, Mzilikazi declared the foundation of his new kingdom. He established military settlements, known as Izinduna, that both protected the land and trained young men in the art of war. Villages grew under his rule, cattle herds multiplied, and the Ndebele identity began to take shape. For the first time since leaving Zululand, his people could breathe without fear of immediate attack. But even in this new land, Mzilikazi never forgot the need for strength. He kept his army disciplined, his regiments organized, and his authority absolute. Warriors trained daily, learning to fight not just as individuals but as a machine, each part moving in harmony with the rest. His people admired his strength and feared his wrath, but above all, they respected him as the man who had led them across rivers, mountains, and deserts to a homeland of their own. This chapter in Mzilikazi's life marks his transformation from rebel to king. He had defied Shaka, survived pursuit, crushed enemies, and built a new nation from nothing. The Ndebele Kingdom was still young, but it was already a power that others feared. Under his command, the Ndebele were no longer wanderers. They were a people with a land, a leader, and a destiny that would echo across the history of Africa. Chapter 3: Forging the Ndebele Kingdom. By the time Mzilikazi and his people settled in the southwestern plateau of present-day Zimbabwe, the long march was finally behind them. Years of constant warfare, endless migrations, and clashes with enemies had turned his followers into a hardened people. Now, under his vision, they began to build not just a refuge, but a kingdom. This new nation would become known as the Ndebele Kingdom, one of the most powerful states in southern Africa during the 19th century. Mzilikazi understood that survival required more than courage on the battlefield. It demanded order, discipline, and a clear structure of authority. Drawing on what he had learned under Shaka Zulu, he organized his kingdom into military settlements called Amakanda. Each was commanded by trusted chiefs, known as Izinduna, who answered directly to him. These regiments served not only as soldiers but also as the backbone of society. Young men were raised in military camps, trained in discipline, loyalty, and the use of the assegai spear and shield. Women and families supported the regiments by maintaining cattle herds and crops. This system ensured that every aspect of life in the kingdom fed into the strength of the state. At the heart of this new nation was Mzilikazi's capital. He moved it several times during his reign, but each settlement reflected his authority and vision. The capital was a hub of activity, with warriors training, advisors meeting in council, and cattle herds grazing under guard. The royal enclosure was at the center, surrounded by a strong palisade, symbolizing both protection and order. Here, Mzilikazi held court, resolving disputes, rewarding bravery, and handing down judgments. His word was law, and his people both feared and respected his authority. What made Mzilikazi unique was his ability to blend cultures. As his people marched north, they absorbed various groups: Zulu, Sotho, Tswana, Kalanga, and others. Instead of forcing them to abandon their identities, he wove their traditions into a new Ndebele identity. Loyalty to the king and service in the army were the unifying bonds, while cultural diversity gave the kingdom resilience and richness. This inclusivity strengthened his rule, as many saw him not just as a conqueror but as a protector and leader who offered a place in his vision of unity. Still, the kingdom was not built without conflict. The fertile lands of southwestern Zimbabwe were home to established groups such as the Kalanga and Rasvi. At first, they resisted the arrival of Mzilikazi's warriors. Battles erupted as the Ndebele raided for cattle and secured territory. But Mzilikazi's military superiority, combined with his clever diplomacy, eventually brought them under his control. Many of their young men were absorbed into his regiments, while elders swore allegiance to his rule. The Ndebele Kingdom expanded rapidly, and within a few years, it had become a formidable regional power. Cattle formed the foundation of wealth in the kingdom. Herds captured during raids were carefully guarded, and their distribution was controlled by Mzilikazi himself. By rewarding loyal warriors with cattle, he ensured their devotion, while chiefs who betrayed his trust were stripped of their herds. This control of resources gave him unmatched authority. To his people, he was not only a military commander but also the ultimate source of prosperity and stability. Religion and belief also played a role in consolidating his power. The Ndebele respected ancestral spirits, and Mzilikazi positioned himself as a leader chosen by destiny. His ability to lead them across hostile lands to a new home was seen as proof of divine favor. Prophets and spiritual leaders often supported his rule, reinforcing the idea that he was more than just a man, he was the guardian of his people's future. Despite his power, Mzilikazi was no tyrant in the mold of Shaka. While he demanded loyalty and discipline, he also inspired admiration. He was known to reward bravery generously, to share in the hardships of his warriors, and to listen to the advice of his closest counselors. This balance of fear and respect allowed him to maintain control over a diverse and expanding kingdom. By the 1840s, the Ndebele Kingdom was firmly established. It stretched across vast lands, controlled trade routes, and inspired both fear and admiration among neighboring peoples. European missionaries and explorers who encountered it were astonished by its organization and the discipline of its people. To them, Mzilikazi was not simply a tribal chief but a monarch in the fullest sense, a statesman, a commander, and a nation builder whose authority extended far beyond the battlefield. In these years, Mzilikazi transformed from a fugitive warrior into a true king. His vision, discipline, and leadership created a nation that stood as a beacon of power in southern Africa. Yet even as his kingdom flourished, challenges loomed on the horizon. The Boers were expanding their frontiers, the British were eyeing new territories, and rival African states still contested his dominance. For the Ndebele and their king, survival would always depend on their readiness for war. Chapter 4: Wars with the Boers. As the Ndebele Kingdom grew strong in the heart of southern Africa, its power and wealth inevitably attracted the attention of outsiders. Among them were the Boers, Dutch-speaking settlers also known as the Voortrekkers, who were moving north from the Cape Colony in search of new land. The Boers were armed with muskets, ox-drawn wagons, and a fierce determination to carve out territory for themselves. For Mzilikazi, they became one of the greatest threats to his young kingdom. The first encounters were tense, but not immediately hostile. Boer leaders like Hendrik Potgieter and Andries Pretorius saw in the fertile Highveld and surrounding regions a chance to establish settlements. But these were the same lands that Mzilikazi considered vital for his people. Conflict was inevitable. By the early 1830s, raids and counter-raids began to escalate into full-scale war. Mzilikazi faced an enemy unlike any he had fought before. Traditional African warfare relied on speed, courage, and the disciplined use of spears and shields. The Boers, by contrast, fought from behind fortified wagons, using long rifles that could kill from a distance. To many, it seemed an uneven fight. But Mzilikazi was no ordinary commander. He understood that to defeat the Boers, he had to adapt his strategies. He employed the same tactics that had carried him through years of migration: surprise attacks, ambushes, and lightning raids. His warriors would strike swiftly at isolated Boer parties, overwhelm them before they could form a defensive circle with their wagons, and then vanish into the landscape. At night, Ndebele regiments moved like shadows, attacking farms and seizing cattle, undermining the settlers' ability to survive. These tactics frustrated the Boers, who were not used to facing an enemy so elusive and relentless. One of the most famous clashes occurred in the mid-1830s when Boer commandos launched a massive offensive against the Ndebele. Expecting to crush them with superior firepower, they advanced into Ndebele territory. Instead, they found themselves harried at every turn. Mzilikazi's scouts tracked their movements, his warriors attacked their supply lines, and his regiments struck where the Boers were weakest. Though the settlers eventually inflicted heavy losses, they also suffered greatly, learning that this was not an enemy who would yield easily. Yet the cost of these wars weighed heavily on the kingdom. Muskets gave the Boers a deadly edge in open battles. When the Ndebele attempted direct assaults on wagon lagers, circles of wagons fortified with rifles, they often paid a terrible price. The crack of gunfire and the smoke of muskets cut down brave warriors before they could close the distance. Mzilikazi quickly realized that survival required caution as well as courage. He shifted his people further north, away from the relentless advance of the Boers. Despite the hardships, these wars cemented Mzilikazi's reputation as one of Africa's greatest military leaders. He did not crumble before superior weapons. Instead, he fought with cunning, retreating when necessary, striking when opportunity allowed, and always preserving the heart of his nation. His decision to move his kingdom deeper into present-day Zimbabwe was not a sign of weakness but of strategic genius. By removing his people from constant conflict, he secured their future and gave them space to grow stronger. The clashes with the Boers also revealed another side of Mzilikazi's leadership: his diplomatic skill. He knew that not every battle could be won with spears and shields. At times, he negotiated truces, using diplomacy to buy time and space for his kingdom. These negotiations often confused his enemies, who expected only brutality. Instead, they found a leader capable of both war and peace, depending on what served his people best. For the Ndebele, these years of war forged an unbreakable identity. They were not merely survivors of the long march north. They were defenders of a kingdom carved out in the face of musket fire and European expansion. Around campfires, elders told stories of how their king had stood against the white settlers, how he had outwitted them, and how his warriors had fought with unmatched bravery. These stories bound the people together, reminding them that their strength lay in unity and discipline. By the late 1830s and early 1840s, the Boers had established themselves in parts of the Highveld, but Mzilikazi had secured his people in the north. The wars had taken their toll, but they had also proven that the Ndebele Kingdom could stand against one of the most formidable enemies of the age. Mzilikazi's decision to withdraw northward, rather than be destroyed in endless battles, was a masterstroke of leadership. It preserved his nation for decades to come. The wars with the Boers were not just military conflicts, they were a test of vision, endurance, and adaptability. Mzilikazi showed that even in the face of gunpowder, African states could resist, adapt, and survive. His kingdom endured, and his name became legend, not only among his people but also among those who tried to conquer him. Chapter 5: The Diplomat King. Though remembered as a warrior, Mzilikazi was far more than just a man of the spear. He understood that to preserve his kingdom in a world of shifting powers, diplomacy was as important as war. The 19th century was an age when European settlers, traders, and missionaries were pushing deeper into the African interior, while African states competed fiercely for dominance. For the Ndebele Kingdom to survive, Mzilikazi had to fight, but he also had to negotiate, adapt, and sometimes even welcome outsiders into his court. Chapter 5: The Diplomat King. Though remembered as a warrior, Mzilikazi was far more than just a man of the spear. He understood that to preserve his kingdom in a world of shifting powers, diplomacy was as important as war. The 19th century was an age when European settlers, traders, and missionaries were pushing deeper into the African interior, while African states competed fiercely for dominance. For the Ndebele Kingdom to survive, Mzilikazi had to fight, but he also had to negotiate, adapt, and sometimes even welcome outsiders into his court. One of the first Europeans to reach his domain was the missionary Robert Moffat, a Scotsman based in Cureman. Moffat traveled north in the 1820s and 1830s, hoping to spread Christianity and establish peaceful relations. When he met Mzilikazi, he encountered a leader who was cautious but also curious. Mzilikazi welcomed him with dignity, asking questions about the wider world, about the power of the British, and about the strange new religion Moffat carried. The king was no fool. He saw in missionaries both an opportunity and a threat. They could bring knowledge, guns, and trade, but they could also act as spies or agents of colonial powers. So, he treated them with respect, but always kept them at arm's length. Mzilikazi's diplomacy extended beyond Europeans. His kingdom sat at the crossroads of powerful neighbors, the Tswana, the Shona, and other groups in the Zimbabwean plateau. Rather than wage endless war, he often forged alliances. He married diplomacy with intimidation, making it clear that those who accepted his friendship would benefit from trade and protection, while those who resisted would face the disciplined fury of his regiments. This careful balance helped him secure peace on some frontiers, freeing his warriors to focus on more pressing enemies. Trade was another weapon in his diplomatic arsenal. The Ndebele Kingdom became a center of exchange, where cattle, ivory, and skins were traded for beads, cloth, and eventually firearms. Mzilikazi controlled this trade tightly, ensuring that his warriors and chiefs depended on his approval to access foreign goods. By doing so, he prevented rival factions from growing too powerful. Everything flowed through him, reinforcing his authority as the heart of the kingdom. But diplomacy did not mean weakness. When negotiation failed, Mzilikazi was quick to remind others of his military strength. Neighboring chiefs who broke agreements or challenged his authority were swiftly dealt with. His regiments moved with precision, crushing resistance before it could spread. This mixture of diplomacy and force made him a figure both feared and respected across the region. Many saw him not just as a king but as a political genius, able to play rivals against each other while keeping his own people united. The missionaries who visited often wrote of his intelligence. They described a man who listened carefully, weighed his words before speaking, and never revealed more than he intended. His questions about the British Empire revealed a sharp awareness of global events, even though he lived far from Europe. He wanted to know how powerful the British truly were, what their intentions in Africa might be, and how best to position his kingdom in a world where outsiders were gaining more and more influence. At the same time, Mzilikazi strengthened the spiritual foundations of his kingdom. Religion in the Ndebele state was deeply tied to loyalty and unity. By supporting spiritual leaders and honoring ancestral rituals, he reinforced the idea that the kingdom was protected not just by warriors but also by the spirits of the ancestors. This spiritual dimension gave his people confidence that their kingdom was blessed and destined to endure, no matter the challenges from beyond. Perhaps the greatest evidence of his diplomatic success was the stability of his kingdom during his lifetime. While many African states crumbled under the twin pressures of internal conflict and European expansion, Mzilikazi's Ndebele Kingdom endured. By mixing diplomacy with force, openness with caution, he created a balance that allowed his people to grow strong and prosper. Yet beneath this stability, he knew storms were gathering. The Boers still lurked in the south, hungry for land. British interests in southern Africa were expanding, and missionaries often acted as the first wave of colonial influence. Mzilikazi could not stop the world from changing, but through diplomacy, he could buy time. And in time, he hoped, his people would grow strong enough to meet whatever challenge came. For his followers, this period was a golden age. They saw their king not only as a warrior who had led them through fire but also as a wise statesman who secured peace, trade, and prosperity. Around the fires at night, they spoke of him as the Lion of the North, a ruler who stood tall against enemies yet extended his hand in peace when it served his people best. Chapter 6: The Lion in Winter. By the 1860s, Mzilikazi was no longer the fierce young warrior who had once marched north from Zululand with fire in his eyes. Age had caught up with him. His hair, once jet black, had turned silver. His body, once strong and commanding, now carried the weight of years of battle and long journeys. Yet even in his final decade, the presence of the great king still inspired respect and fear. When he entered the royal court, chiefs fell silent, warriors straightened their backs, and visitors knew they were in the company of a man who had shaped the destiny of southern Africa. Mzilikazi had built his kingdom from nothing, carving it out of the chaos of the Mfikane Wars. Now, in his later years, he thought less of conquest and more of preservation. He wanted to ensure that the Ndebele Kingdom would endure after his death. This meant managing rivalries among his chiefs, balancing the power of different regiments, and most importantly, preparing his chosen successor. That successor was Lobengula, a strong and intelligent son who showed the leadership qualities needed to carry on his father's vision. But grooming Lobengula was no simple matter. Ndebele politics were complex, and other factions within the royal family had their own ambitions. Some chiefs whispered in favor of different candidates, hoping to benefit if their chosen prince became king. Mzilikazi knew these rivalries could tear the kingdom apart if left unchecked. So he used his final years to carefully consolidate support, reminding his people that unity was their greatest strength. He called councils, rewarded loyalty, and quietly punished betrayal, ensuring that when the time came, his chosen heir would not face a divided kingdom. Even as his health declined, Mzilikazi remained sharp in mind. He still received envoys, listened to reports from his scouts, and kept watch on events beyond his borders. The Boers continued to push northward, while British influence expanded steadily in southern Africa. He knew that the next generation of Ndebele rulers would face challenges greater than anything he had encountered. Where he had fought against scattered tribes and migrating settlers, his son would face the full power of European colonial ambition. It was a storm already brewing on the horizon, and Mzilikazi could only hope that the foundations he had laid would be strong enough to weather it. The king also began to spend more time in spiritual reflection. Ndebele belief in the ancestors had always been central to his reign, and now, as he neared the end of his life, he sought their guidance more than ever. Rituals were performed in his honor, and healers and spiritual leaders were often summoned to the royal kraal. To his people, this was not just the fating of a man but the preparation of a spirit who would one day join the ancestors and continue to guide the nation from the other side. Among his warriors, the stories of his battles became legend. Young men who had never seen him fight still trained in regiments built on his reforms. They marched with shields and spears in the same disciplined formations he had perfected decades earlier. Around the fires, older soldiers recounted how the king had once led them across rivers, deserts, and battlefields, outwitting enemies and creating a home where none had existed before. To them, he was not just a leader but the living embodiment of courage, strategy, and endurance. As the seasons passed, Mzilikazi withdrew more often to his private quarters. He was no longer seen as frequently in public, though when he did appear, the sight of him still commanded awe. Visitors noted the quiet dignity with which he carried himself. His steps may have been slower, but his eyes remained sharp. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of experience. Chiefs listened carefully, knowing that even in decline, the Lion of the North had wisdom no one could ignore. By 1868, his health had worsened. Rumors spread across the kingdom that the great king was nearing his final days. Fear and uncertainty rippled through the regiments, but Mzilikazi remained calm. He knew death was not the end but a passage. In his last gatherings with his council, he urged them to stand united, to honor the laws and customs he had established, and to remain loyal to his chosen heir. A divided house cannot stand, he is remembered as saying. But if you remain one people, the Ndebele will endure. When he finally passed, the kingdom mourned as one. Women wailed in grief, warriors beat their shields in sorrow, and elders spoke of the end of an era. Mzilikazi was buried with the honors befitting a great king, laid to rest not just as a ruler but as the founder of a nation. His people knew that though his body was gone, his spirit lived on, guarding the Ndebele from the world of the ancestors. And so ended the life of Mzilikazi, the warrior, the king, the diplomat, and the father of a nation. But his story was not over. For the throne now passed to Lobengula, and the challenges of the new age were only beginning. Chapter 7: The Legacy of a Lion. When Mzilikazi passed in 1868, the grief of the Ndebele was deep and heavy. Yet beneath the sorrow lay a pressing question: who would carry forward the kingdom that the great Lion of the North had built? Succession in African monarchies was rarely smooth, and among the Ndebele, there were many who had ambitions of their own. But Mzilikazi had prepared carefully, leaving behind both a vision and a chosen heir, his son Lobengula. Lobengula was not his eldest son, but he was widely respected for his intelligence, strength, and calm authority. He had grown up watching his father govern, absorbing the lessons of leadership from one of Africa's greatest kings. He had fought in campaigns, attended councils, and learned how to balance diplomacy and force. More importantly, Mzilikazi had made it clear that Lobengula was to succeed him. This decision, however, did not silence rival factions. Some chiefs whispered about other princes, hoping to gain influence through a different claimant. The days following Mzilikazi's burial were tense. Chiefs gathered, regiments waited, and rumors of civil war spread. But in the end, the memory of Mzilikazi's authority prevailed. His final commands weighed heavily on the council, and those loyal to his vision pressed for unity. Lobengula's composure also helped. He did not demand the throne with arrogance but stepped forward with steady confidence, declaring that his role was to honor his father's legacy and keep the kingdom strong. This humility and strength won over many who had doubted him. Once he was installed as king, Lobengula faced the enormous challenge of ruling a kingdom founded by a legend. Mzilikazi's shadow loomed large, and comparisons were inevitable. But Lobengula proved himself capable. Like his father, he ruled with a mixture of generosity and firmness. He rewarded loyalty, punished betrayal, and worked to maintain the discipline of the regiments. He kept the structures Mzilikazi had built intact, ensuring that the state remained stable. Yet the world Lobengula inherited was changing rapidly. Where Mzilikazi had dealt with Boers and missionaries on the frontier, Lobengula faced the growing reach of the British Empire. Traders, hunters, and explorers were pushing deeper into southern Africa. Missionaries wrote back to Europe, describing the wealth of the Ndebele lands. And in the distance, mining companies were beginning to eye the mineral riches that lay beneath the soil. Still, in the early years of his reign, Lobengula carried the confidence of his people. The Ndebele warriors remained loyal, their regiments still moving with the discipline their founder had instilled. The kingdom prospered through trade in cattle and ivory. The authority of the king was unquestioned, supported by spiritual rituals that linked him to the ancestors and to Mzilikazi himself, now venerated as a founding spirit. Among the people, stories of Mzilikazi were told nightly. Parents reminded their children of the long trek north, of the battles against the Boers, of the way the king had created order out of chaos. These tales were not only memories but also lessons, binding the community together. To the young, Mzilikazi was almost a mythic figure, half man, half legend, whose spirit still guarded them. And for Lobengula, this legacy was both a gift and a burden. He inherited a strong kingdom, but he also carried the responsibility of living up to a father who had been larger than life. To honor that legacy, Lobengula embraced the title of king not with reckless ambition but with cautious wisdom. He sought to preserve the peace his father had secured through diplomacy, while also ensuring that the military might of the Ndebele remained feared. His court became a place where foreign visitors were received with ceremony, where warriors pledged their loyalty, and where elders invoked the blessing of Mzilikazi's spirit. The transition of power could easily have torn the Ndebele kingdom apart. But because of Mzilikazi's careful planning, and because of Lobengula's measured leadership, the kingdom remained united. This was a testament to the Lion of the North. Even in death, his influence shaped events. His teachings guided his son, his laws kept order among the people, and his name inspired warriors to fight with pride. The kingdom entered a new era under Lobengula, but it carried the heartbeat of Mzilikazi. Every regiment that trained, every council that met, every trader who came to barter all operated within the system he had created. The foundation was his gift to his people, and it was strong enough to endure beyond his life. For the Ndebele, the death of Mzilikazi had not been an ending but a turning of the page. The lion had roared his last on earth, but his echo lived on through his son, his people, and the kingdom he had carved with courage and vision. Chapter 8: Storms on the Horizon. Lobengula inherited a kingdom that was strong, disciplined, and respected. His father, Mzilikazi, had forged it through war, migration, and diplomacy. The foundations were solid, but the world around the Ndebele kingdom was shifting quickly. By the late 19th century, European influence in southern Africa had grown far beyond what Mzilikazi had faced. For Lobengula, the challenge was not only to protect his people from neighboring tribes and settlers, but also to navigate the rising tide of colonial ambition. At first, Lobengula continued the cautious diplomacy of his father. He welcomed missionaries, hunters, and traders into his court, listening to their words and studying their intentions. Reports describe him as a large man with an imposing presence, thoughtful in his decisions, and wary of strangers. Like Mzilikazi, he asked questions about the world beyond his borders, about Britain, about the colonies, and about the mining companies that seemed eager to cross into his lands. The Ndebele kingdom was rich in resources. Its cattle herds were strong, its lands fertile, and beneath its soil lay gold and minerals that Europeans craved. Lobengula understood the value of these resources and guarded them carefully. He allowed some trade, but he resisted giving away too much. For him, the kingdom's independence was more important than foreign wealth. But the pressure was relentless. By the 1870s and 1880s, the British and the Boers were both expanding their territories. The discovery of diamonds in Kimberley and gold in the Transvaal had triggered a rush for land and resources. Adventurers, prospectors, and company agents began circling around the Ndebele Kingdom, searching for opportunities to secure mining rights. Lobengula faced constant visits from European envoys, each offering treaties, gifts, and promises of friendship. Yet he knew that behind their smiles lay hunger for land and power. The missionaries, too, played their part. While some genuinely sought to spread their faith, others acted as intermediaries for colonial interests. They wrote letters to Europe describing the wealth of Lobengula's kingdom, fueling the ambitions of companies eager to expand into Central and Southern Africa. These reports painted the Ndebele as both a people of great power and as a prize waiting to be claimed. Still, Lobengula held his ground. He continued to command the loyalty of his warriors, who remained the backbone of the kingdom. The regiments trained as they had under Mzilikazi, their discipline and formation unmatched in the region. Neighboring groups still feared the Ndebele military machine, and raids for cattle and resources reminded everyone that the kingdom was far from weak. But Lobengula also knew that guns were changing the balance of power. European settlers and colonial troops carried rifles and artillery that could tear through traditional shields and spears. The assegai and ox-hide shield, once symbols of dominance, were becoming less effective against modern firepower. This reality weighed heavily on the king. He recognized that the old ways of war were being tested by new technologies, and he began seeking firearms through trade, though access was tightly controlled by colonial authorities. Despite these pressures, Lobengula maintained order within his kingdom. He continued the traditions of his father, honoring the ancestors and holding great gatherings where warriors pledged their loyalty. Around the royal kraal, the memory of Mzilikazi remained strong. Elders often reminded the younger generation of how the kingdom had been built, how the Lion of the North had led them through hardship to this land. That memory was a source of unity and pride, binding the people together even as threats grew on all sides. Yet the storms could not be held back forever. By the 1880s, the British South Africa Company, led by Cecil Rhodes, began pressing hard to secure concessions. They sent agents with treaties written in English, offering wealth and protection in exchange for mining rights. To Lobengula, these treaties were dangerous traps, filled with language designed to strip him of sovereignty. He resisted, delaying, questioning, and refusing to sign away his people's future. But the pressure mounted, and divisions began to emerge within the kingdom. Some chiefs and advisors believed cooperation with Europeans could bring benefits, while others argued that any concession would lead to the loss of independence. The debate grew sharper as more envoys arrived, bringing gifts of guns, alcohol, and promises that tempted the greedy and the ambitious. For Lobengula, it was a battle not just of armies but of politics and survival. His father had faced enemies he could see on the battlefield. Now, the threat came dressed in suits, carrying papers, and speaking of partnership while dreaming of conquest. The king stood firm, but he could feel the walls closing in. The Ndebele people, proud and united, still believed in the strength of their nation. But whispers of change carried on the wind. The savannah stretched wide and endless, as it always had, but beyond the horizon new powers were gathering. The storm that Mzilikazi had sensed in his final years was now rolling closer. For Lobengula, the task was clear: defend the kingdom at all costs, honor the legacy of Mzilikazi, and prepare his people for a struggle unlike any they had faced before. Chapter 9: Clash with the Empire. By the early 1890s, the tensions that had built during Lobengula's reign could no longer be contained. For years he had resisted signing away his people's land and wealth, but the British South Africa Company, led by Cecil Rhodes, was relentless. The company's agents arrived with smooth words, impressive gifts, and papers full of legal traps. Lobengula signed one treaty, the Rudd Concession of 1888, believing it allowed only limited mining rights. In reality, the document handed sweeping powers to the company. It was a moment that marked the beginning of open conflict. When news of the concession spread, Lobengula realized the extent of the deception. He tried to backtrack, sending envoys to the British Crown to explain that he had been misled. But the momentum of imperial expansion was too strong. Rhodes and his company had already claimed the concession as their ticket to invade and occupy the Ndebele Kingdom. Within a short time, columns of settlers and soldiers began pushing into the land that Mzilikazi had once carved out with blood and discipline. At first, Lobengula attempted to contain the crisis with diplomacy. He forbade his warriors from attacking settlers directly, fearing it would trigger a full-scale war. But his control was not absolute. Skirmishes broke out on the frontier as angry Ndebele warriors confronted intruders. Reports of these clashes were exaggerated by the company, used as justification for military action. The stage was set for war. In 1893, the First Ndebele War erupted. The Ndebele regiments, still loyal to their king and trained in the traditions of Mzilikazi, marched out with their shields, assegais, and courage. They sang war songs and struck their shields in rhythm, confident in the memory of past victories. But this time, the enemy was unlike any they had faced before. The British South Africa Company's forces carried Maxim guns, the new machine guns that could unleash a hail of bullets faster than any warrior could charge. At Shangani and Bambizi, the Ndebele regiments attacked with bravery, storming the enemy positions in great waves. They closed ranks, shields held high, spears raised for the strike. For a moment, it seemed as if the discipline of Mzilikazi's legacy might overwhelm the settlers. Then the machine guns opened fire. The slaughter was devastating. Hundreds of warriors fell in minutes, their formations torn apart by the relentless firepower. The courage of the Ndebele was no match for the technology of empire. Survivors retreated, regrouped, and attacked again, but each charge ended the same way. The Maxim gun, with its cold, mechanical precision, cut down men who had once been invincible on the plains. Lobengula watched with heavy heart as his proud regiments were destroyed. He had seen the shift coming. His father had warned of storms on the horizon, but even he could not have imagined the scale of destruction modern weapons would bring. The Ndebele Kingdom, forged in the discipline of the spear, was being undone by the power of industrial war. After these defeats, Lobengula retreated north with what remained of his forces. He hoped to regroup, to draw the British deeper into the land where they might be slowed by distance and supply lines. But illness and exhaustion weighed on him. As the company troops advanced, reports reached them that Lobengula had died of smallpox while on the march in early 1894. Without their king, the Ndebele resistance fractured. Yet even in defeat, the spirit of resistance did not vanish. Many warriors continued to fight in smaller bands, refusing to submit. In 1896, the Ndebele would rise again in the Second Ndebele War, also called the First Kamurenga, proving that the legacy of Mzilikazi still burned in their hearts. But the kingdom he had built, and that Lobengula had tried to protect, had fallen to the forces of empire. For the British South Africa Company, the conquest was a triumph. They claimed the lands of the Ndebele and the Shona, establishing the colony that would become Rhodesia. But for the Ndebele people, it was a tragedy. They had watched their proud independence, their cattle, and their lands slip into foreign hands. Still, the memory of resistance remained. Generations later, the story of Mzilikazi and Lobengula would be retold as a symbol of African courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The kingdom may have fallen, but the spirit of the Lion of the North and his son would inspire future struggles for freedom. Chapter 10: The Enduring Legacy. The fall of the Ndebele Kingdom in the 1890s marked the end of an era, but it was not the end of the story. Though Lobengula's reign ended in exile and loss, and Mzilikazi's kingdom was swallowed by the ambitions of empire, their legacy lived on in the memory of their people. Together, they represented courage, resilience, and the determination of Africans to stand against overwhelming odds. For the Ndebele, Mzilikazi remained the great founder. He had taken a scattered group of warriors and refugees and forged them into a disciplined nation. His trek north, filled with hardship and battle, became the defining epic of the people. Around fires, parents told their children how the Lion of the North had led them across rivers and plains, defeating enemies, building order, and giving them a homeland. He was remembered not only as a warrior but also as a visionary who combined discipline with diplomacy, creating a kingdom that endured for decades. Lobengula, though often remembered for the tragic loss of the kingdom, was no less important. He carried the heavy burden of his father's legacy during a time when Africa faced the full force of European expansion. Unlike Mzilikazi, who had fought enemies he could meet face to face, Lobengula faced the weapons of industry and the cunning of colonial treaties. His struggle was different, but his resolve was the same. He resisted for as long as he could, refusing to hand over his people's independence without a fight. The defeat of the Ndebele by the Maxim gun became a symbol of the new reality Africa faced in the late 19th century. Traditional courage, discipline, and strategy could not overcome the industrial machines of Europe. Yet the bravery of the Ndebele regiments, charging against impossible odds, left an imprint that would echo through history. They became an example of resistance, proof that African nations did not surrender easily, even when outgunned. In the years that followed, the memory of Mzilikazi and Lobengula became a source of pride for Africans resisting colonial rule. During the 20th century, when movements for independence swept across the continent, leaders and thinkers often invoked the names of past kings and warriors. The Ndebele story was told again and again, not as a tale of defeat, but as a lesson in resilience and unity. Even today, the legacy of Mzilikazi endures in southern Africa. Place names, oral traditions, and cultural practices keep his memory alive. Among the Ndebele, he is honored as the founder, the lion whose roar once shook the plains. Historians see him as one of the greatest African leaders of the 19th century, a man who built a powerful state in a time of chaos. Lobengula, too, is remembered with respect. Though his kingdom fell, his efforts to protect his people from colonial exploitation are recognized as part of the larger African resistance against imperialism. His story is not one of failure, but of tragic inevitability, a leader caught between two worlds, fighting with the tools of the past against the machines of the future. Together, father and son represent the arc of African history in the 19th century, the rise of powerful indigenous kingdoms, their flowering under wise and strong rulers, and their eventual confrontation with European empires. Their lives show the complexity of that history, not just war and conquest, but diplomacy, leadership, faith, and resilience. The Ndebele Kingdom may have fallen, but the people endured. They carried forward their traditions, their language, and their pride. The memory of Mzilikazi and Lobengula was kept alive, passed from one generation to the next, until it became part of the identity of modern Zimbabwe and beyond. In the end, the story of Mzilikazi and Lobengula is not simply about kings and battles. It is about a people who refused to be broken, about leaders who carried the weight of nations on their shoulders, and about the legacy of African resistance in the face of empire. The Lion of the North still roars in memory, and his son's struggle still echoes in the lessons of history. Together, they remain symbols of courage and endurance, reminders that though empires rise and fall, the spirit of a people cannot be conquered.